Hey there, hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk through camera settings. So there's a million different rabbit trails you can go down when it comes to camera settings. Today I want to focus on the big three, the exposure triangle, the ones that you're going to be using the most. And I want to talk about them in terms of getting a clean image with a balanced exposure. That's really all I'm dealing with today. Is we want to learn how to effectively get a balanced exposure and a clean and sharp image. I'll show you a couple examples of what I mean when I say balanced exposure. Not too bright in the highlights, not too dark in the shadows. That's sort of what I mean. Something with a very even, not too harsh exposure in one direction or the other. And a sharp image is just, well, a sharp image. It doesn't have very much motion blur, very much if any motion blur. The area that you chose to place your focus is tack sharp, exactly how you want it. To help us understand how and when to change our settings, I have three different photography scenarios that I want to talk through, and the settings that I generally go to when I am shooting that kind of thing. Before we get into these scenarios, I want to quickly go over each of the camera settings and give you a basic overview of what they do and what their drawbacks are in case you don't know already. First, your ISO value. This is the measurement of your camera sensor's sensitivity to the light coming through the lens. And as you increase this value, your image is going to be brighter because your camera is going to become more sensitive to the light coming through the lens. But in exchange, you are going to get a progressively noisier image the higher ISOs you go. Next, let's talk about your shutter speed. Your shutter speed is the speed at which your camera shutter, mechanical or otherwise, opens and closes and lets light into the sensor. The camera shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. And as you go up higher to like 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, as you go up, your camera shutter is going to stay open longer, letting more light in, but you are losing sharpness. You're not freezing a moment in time. That's why you'll see long exposure images that have these light trails if there are cars driving through the frame. That's because the shutter was open from when the car was here to all the way when the car was over here. And so you're seeing its tail lights from here to here because it's letting that light in. When you go the other direction with shutter speed into 1/100th, 1/200th, 1/8000th of a second, those are very quick opening and closing of the shutter, and it's freezing more and more that moment in time. Lastly, let's talk about your aperture. Your aperture or your f-stop is the opening inside your lens that's letting light into the camera. And your f-stop is a measurement of the size of the opening that measures inversely to the actual size of the opening. Let me explain what that means. The lower the number, 1.4, 1.2, 1.8, those openings, the opening inside your lens is going to be much bigger than something like f/16, f/22. Your aperture also controls your depth of field. Your depth of field controls how much of your image is going to be sharp when you focus. So I can give you a couple examples of varying f-stops and then how they're affecting your depth of field. The lower you go in your aperture, the shallower your depth of field is going to be. That's how people get that creamy, blurred background, the bokeh that everybody loves. They're shooting at a low f-stop, 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. And the higher you go up into the f4s, up to f32 or however high your camera goes, your image is getting sharper from foreground to background. So shooting at a high f-stop is going to allow you to get the entire frame from the foreground to the background sharp in focus. A lower f-stop, 1.4, something like that, is going to only have a certain area of the image in focus, like somebody's face, somebody's eye. Now, choosing the right combination of settings is an extremely important part of achieving a well-balanced, well-exposed image. So instead of trying to give a universal rule of how to get a well-exposed image, which I can't do, it doesn't work like that. So I'm gonna give you a couple of scenarios that will hopefully help you understand what I see as the ideal settings for those scenarios so that you can apply them and hopefully get well-balanced, well-exposed, sharp images. Let's talk through these different scenarios. Number one is gonna be portrait photography. Portrait photography, in my opinion, is a pretty easy environment to nail your settings in. It's a good place to start if you're new to shooting in manual. Generally speaking, you want to shoot at a semi-low aperture. something between like 1.4 to 3.2. This is going to give you that really clear separation between subject and background. Obviously, the depth of field is a stylistic choice. You can shoot portraits at f/22 if you want, and if you like them, do your thing, man. All good. Generally speaking, a lower depth of field is going to be what you want for portraits. When it comes to the shutter speed and ISO, this is going to sort of be situational depending on your environment. You really want to have a healthy balance of a low ISO for minimal noise so that it's easy to edit and it's a really clean and sharp image as best as you can do it, and a high enough shutter speed where you are not getting any motion blur if your subject moves or if you move. Scenario number 2, landscape photography. Now, I know I said portrait photography is really easy to nail your settings, but landscape photography might be by far the easiest place to get a proper exposure. The difficulty, as with anything, there's a drawback. The difficulty lies in creating a compelling frame. Being patient enough to get the right conditions. You want to have a very compelling, interesting frame in landscape photography. But when it comes to your settings, once you know how you want to shoot the photo, it's the easiest because you often have plenty of time. When I shoot landscapes, I generally determine my aperture first. This is because out of all three of them, aperture is the most stylistic of the three. You really have the most artistic choice to make when it comes to selecting your aperture. I have to decide, do I want to get everything tack sharp, or do I want to utilize a more shallow depth of field to draw the viewer's eye to a certain part of the landscape? All of those are choices you have to make, and they're directly connected to your aperture. So I select that first and adjust everything else accordingly. Often I'm shooting a landscape where I'm shooting it pretty wide and I want to have just about everything in focus. So I shoot anywhere between f4 and f11 depending on the available light. Next, I'll determine my shutter speed. Lots of landscape photographers like to have the long, smooth clouds or blurred waves in the water, that kind of thing. And I like to stay away from that. I just don't personally like it. I'm also not a huge fan of long exposures in general. So I tend to stay away from that, and so I'll most of the time shoot it anywhere faster than 1/200th of a second. I usually hover around 1/200th of a second. And I'll keep the ISO as low as I possibly can to preserve every bit of detail in this photo and prevent any noise. Lastly, let's talk about street photography. This might be my absolute favorite of the three. Street photography is, on the one hand, the hardest place to nail your settings, but on the other hand, one of the most rewarding places when you do. Street photography is an insanely unpredictable environment, and you're always changing lighting conditions, you're changing atmospheres, environments, you're changing what you're shooting. You're going from shooting buildings to a skyline, to a car, to a person, to a dog, back to a building. It's impressive to nail your settings every time, and next to impossible. So nailing your settings in street photography is hard. You gotta be quick, you gotta be well practiced, but if you wanna learn how to nail your settings more often, I highly recommend go out and shoot street photos. Shoot in a changing environment like that. It's trial by fire, but it's worth it. It's unpredictable, it's always changing. How can you say these settings are gonna be what you wanna be on most of the time? Because I've done a lot. I've shot a lot of street photography, and a good baseline is gonna be starting somewhere around 1/200th of a second for your shutter speed, and between 100 and 320 for your ISO. These are solid, they're gonna help you decrease noise, always get a sharp image. If you've got the available light, that's what I suggest. Then an aperture somewhere between 1.8 and 2.8. I mean, going down to 1.4, 1.2 is just fine, but I tend to like a little bit more sharp in my street photos than I do other places. So 1.8 is a good starting low aperture. That way you're bringing in a lot of light as much as you can, and if you need to adjust settings accordingly, go for it. Like I said, all of these settings are going to depend on the environment you're shooting in. It's not a hard and fast rule, it's just a principle, it's a guideline, it's something to keep in mind. And a lot of these principles from these three scenarios can be applied in a ton of other places. Car photos, weddings, that kind of thing. Just take these principles and apply them in every area, and you got to kind of figure it out. Shooting in manual, shooting in aperture priority, shooting in these modes is something that takes a lot of time and practice. It's a muscle memory skill, and it's a pattern recognition skill as well. You have to understand when have you seen a situation like this before and what were your settings then. Go out, practice, go into each of these 3 scenarios, find what works for you and find what you like. I hope this was helpful. I know that when I was starting out shooting in manual, this was like the most daunting thing ever. It's really not as hard as it sounds, and I think you can do it. I know you can. If you have any more questions, please feel free to ask me. If you've got a specific scenario that you need help with, let me know. I'll give you my recommendations. And I think that's about it. Y'all like, subscribe, and I'll catch you later.